Hello, boys and girls. So, last time we left off reading The Monsters of Morley Manor, we had just finished giving Mr. Perkins a bath. And during our bath that Anthony and Sarah were giving him, a little bit of water got splashed onto the hand of one of the figurines that Anthony had found in the box. Okay? And as we realized kind of what was happening, his hand started to change color and turn to more of a fleshy tone, and it started to move. So that was a pretty big cliffhanger. And we're going to kind of jump in and we're going to read chapters 3 and 4 of this book now. Okay? Because we need to see what happens. All right, so chapter 3 is called Just Add Water. I slapped Albert back into the box, closed the lid, and latched it. Then I put the box in the bottom drawer of my desk, closed the drawer, and locked that too. But I didn't leave it there. I couldn't. Which isn't to say I didn't try. But I couldn't sleep thinking about that tiny hand, stretching and grasping. It was horrifying, but not as horrifying as the idea that a living creature was locked, frozen in a desk. A creature I could revive just by adding water. If Mr. Perkins hadn't splashed him, if I hadn't seen that hand move, I would never have known, and it wouldn't have made any difference. But I did know, and because I did know, it seemed to me that I had to do something about it. The thought of keeping some tiny person frozen, or statued, or whatever, was too awful to live with. Unfortunately, the idea of bringing him completely to life was pretty awful as well. After all, it was possible he had been frozen for a reason. What kind of monster was he, anyway? Well, a small one to begin with. It wasn't as if he could tear me limb from limb or anything. After fussing like this for an hour or so, I got out of bed, slipped into my robe, and went to my desk. I took out the box and opened it. Albert's fist was still moving, clenching and unclenching, a bit of living flesh stuck on a lifeless metallic figurine. I took a deep breath, then whispered, "All right, buddy, let's thaw you out." I tucked Albert into the pocket of my robe, then stepped into the hall. It was dark and quiet. I hoped Mr. Perkins was asleep and not just hiding somewhere, getting ready to jump on my head and pee on me again. About halfway down the hall, I stopped and went back to Sarah's room. I stood outside her door, trying to decide whether to wake her. Part of me wanted to do this on my own, keep it all to myself. Another part of me thought it would be a good idea to have someone else along, just in case things got out of hand. So I would have someone to talk to about it. Also, it's always better to have Sarah along when I'm doing something that might get me in trouble, since my parents never seem to get as mad when she's involved. Finally, I knocked on the door and pushed it open and hissed, "Sarah, wake up!" She moaned. "What do you want, Anthony?" She doesn't like waking up, especially in the middle of the night. "I have to show you something." She sat up fast, and I remember the last time I woke her up and said those words. I had also dropped a snake onto her bed. "This is different," I said urgently. I turned on the lamp next to her bed and I spoke, then thrust Albert into the cone of light. Sarah gasped at the sight of his tiny moving fingers. Scooching back against the wall, she whispered, "Anthony, that is too weird," she shuddered, then asked, "How did you do it?" "It happened when he got wet. I'm going to go get the rest of him wet now." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Do you think you should?" "I have to. It's not right to leave him like this." "Maybe he's that way for a reason," said Sarah, who was very big on being sensible. "Maybe he's evil." "Maybe whoever froze him was evil." Sarah thought about that for a moment. Though she's big on being sensible, she's also big on compassion. She'll probably be a vegetarian in a year or so. "How can we find out?" she whispered at last. "Unfreeze him." "What if he turns out that he's evil?" "We'll squash him." I said that with a very more certainty than I felt, and I had a brief vision of Albert escaping and hiding in the walls, then sneaking out at night to torment us. But just as I was about to change my mind about thawing him out, Sarah said, Okay, let's do it. She slipped out of bed and grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand. We both used to have flashlights, but I had lost mine. We tiptoed down the hall, though we didn't really need to. Grandma Walker is so hard of hearing, we probably could have stomped to the bathroom without waking her up. Albert's tiny hand continued stretching and grasping, something I could see all too well by the glow of Sarah's flashlight. What do we do now? Asked Sarah when we got to the bathroom. Get him wet, I replied. I looked at him for a second, then added, should we sprinkle him or dunk him? Sarah thought about it. Dunk him, she said at last. It would be really gross if he came to life with little spots all over his body. Dangerous, too, maybe. I mean, for him. I wasn't sure what the medical rules were for bringing a monster back to life, but I decided Sarah was right. So we filled the sink. I dipped Albert into the water, planning to pull him right back out. But as soon as I put him in, the water began bubbling and boiling, splashing over the edge of the sink like some sort of weird chemical reaction. I dropped Albert and jumped back with a yelp. A weird green glow came from the sink. Sarah huddled against me. I didn't push her away. When the water calmed down, I saw a hand thrust through the surface. He's drowning, hissed Sarah. Go save him, Anthony. I started forward, but Albert was already hauling himself onto the edge of the sink. He shook his head, spattering tiny drops of water in all directions. Then he stood, looked around, scratched his head, and said, Oi, now what has the boss gotten me into? He started to walk along the edge of the basin. What a strange white road, he muttered. I cleared my throat. Albert glanced up at me and Sarah. Yikes, he screamed. Monsters! Then he dived back into the sink. I hurried over and looked in. Albert was at the bottom of the basin, clinging to the drain plug. I didn't do anything at first, but when I began to be afraid he might drown, I reached in and pulled him out. He pounded on my fingers as I lifted him. I half expected him to bite me in order to get me to drop him, but that was probably only because I've spent so much time with Mr. Perkins. Albert didn't bite. He just squirmed like a demented squirrel, shouting, Let me go, you big brute! I never did anything to you! Hey, I said softly. I'm not going to hurt you. I thawed you out, didn't I? He blinked, and a series of expressions raced across his face, shifting through surprise, understanding, anger, fear, and back to understanding. Uh-oh, he said. I think we've got a little problem here. Looking up at me, he asked in a suspicious voice, What are you, anyway? I'm a kid. His eyes got wider. How did you get so big? How did you get so small? I responded. We stared at each other for a moment. As far as I was concerned, I wasn't all that big. Heck, if I was, I wouldn't have so many problems with Ralph Mongram at school. But I was currently being compared to Albert. At first, I had figured that the little guy had somehow gotten shrunk, but now I wondered if he was from some other world. Maybe he had always been this size, and we humans were giants compared to his people. Would you put me down, please? He asked softly. I set him on the edge of the sink, then knelt so that we were face to face. His head was about the size of my eyeball. Sarah knelt next to me. Where are you from? She asked. Brooklyn, originally, said Albert. Brooklyn? I asked. Yeah, as in New York City. Then I lived in Transylvania for a while. Well, those were both on Earth, so much for that other world theory. Sounding nervous, Albert asked, Where am I now? Owl's Roost, Nebraska, said Sarah proudly. Albert's eyes widened. But that's where I live, he swallowed. You're not giants, are you? Sarah and I shook our heads. Albert sat down cross-legged, his shoulders drooping, his hump nearly as high as his head. I've been shrunk, he moaned. He sounded really depressed. I suppose you couldn't blame him. Suddenly he jumped to his feet. Where are the others? In the box, I replied. The box? The box you came in, explained Sarah. Well, go get them. Then we have to figure out a way to get back to our normal size. He looked around, then said, Wait a minute. What year is this? It is 1948, isn't it? From the tone of his voice, I could tell he had a pretty good idea that it wasn't 1948. But when I told him that he was off by more than 50 years, he screamed. Martin did this! Oh, I know he was up to no good. Come on, we have to wake up the others. What's the hurry? I asked, not sure I wanted to deal with 5 little monsters. Albert leapt from the sink, grabbed the front of my pajamas, and scrambled up my chest like a sailor climbing a ship's rigging. I jumped backwards and tried to brush him off, but he was too strong. Once he had reached my shoulder, he stuck his head in my ear and bellowed, The hurry is they're my family and I don't want them frozen. Besides, I'm not the smart one. We need Gaspar and Ludmilla. Now go get them. Geez, I thought Mr. Perkins was a problem. We started down the hall to fetch the other monsters, Albert riding in the big pocket on the left side of my bathrobe. Sarah positioned herself on the other side of me, then tugged my sleeve and whispered, Anthony, do you think this is a good idea? It's probably a terrible idea, I replied, but it's the most interesting thing we've ever done. Besides, I don't think we could talk Albert out of it, and even if we could... Sarah nodded as my voice trailed off. I sensed that, like me, she was thinking about the little monsters having been frozen, or whatever, for over 50 years. It was time to thaw them out. When we got to my room, I set Albert on my desk. He ran to the box. Boss! He cried in horror when he saw Gaspar. Oh, boss, what has that maniac done to you? I take it he didn't always look like that, I asked, picking up the lizard-headed monster. I'm not worried about how he looks, you idiot, Albert said. We can change that. The fact that he's been shrunk and turned into a statue is what has me upset. He walked along the front of the box, gazing into each compartment. Poor Melisande, he sighed. Poor Ludmilla, asleep for over half a century. Not what you'd call sleeping beauties, I remarked. Beauty is as beauty does, snapped Albert. He stopped in front of the last slot, the one with the wolfman-type guy. Alas, poor Bob, he said, patting the figurine on the head. Trapped in this horrible form all these years. So Bob didn't always look like that either? Asked Sarah. Albert shook his head. Only occasionally. He's where? Where what? I asked. Then I got it. Oh, you mean he's a werewolf? Not quite, said Albert. Come on, let's stop with the jabbering and wake them up. I put Gaspar back in the box, then picked up the whole set. With Albert on my shoulder and Sarah at my side, I headed to the bathroom. It was monster time. Chapter 4. The Family Morleskevich. Putting Albert in the sink had made it act like a bubbling stew pot. Dropping 4 monsters in at once just turned it into a geyser. Water sprayed everywhere, coming out so forcefully it hit the ceiling, not to mention splashing all over me and Sarah. As before, a weird green glow lit the water from within. The bubbling stopped. The glow faded. 4 coughing, gagging little monsters climbed out of the sink. They were wet, bedraggled, and extremely confused. But they were also overjoyed to see one another. Melisande! Shouted Ludmilla. Ludmilla! Shouted Melisande. They threw their arms around each other and hugged. Then Melisande looked up and spotted me and Sarah. Her snakes began writhing in horror, and she let out a scream. It was amazingly loud for someone so tiny. I heard an answering scream and realized Mr. Perkins was on the prowl. I wondered if he thought Melisande was another monkey. I shut the bathroom door just to be safe. The other monsters had looked up when Melisande screamed. Their eyes went wide and they cowered together, except for Gaspar, the lizard-headed guy. He just closed his eyes and heaved a deep sigh. Despite Albert's attempts to assure Ludmilla and Melisande that Sarah and I were friendly, it took several minutes for them to settle down. When they finally did, Albert introduced first Sarah, then me. They were the ones who disenchanted us, he said, sounding at least surprised as he was grateful. Gaspar looked up at us, then made a deep bow. It was clear he wasn't used to doing that, because he bumped his nose against the sink. He stood up and straightened his lab coat, obviously trying to pretend the bump had not happened. In a deep voice, with his tongue flicking in and out, he said, My profound thanks to you for releasing me and my family from our imprisonment. Albert had said something about family, too. So you guys are all, related? I asked. Gaspar smiled, which was something terrifying given how many teeth he had. Well, Albert isn't actually family, though he has worked for me for so long that it often feels like he is. But Ludmilla and Melisande are my sisters, and Bob is our faithful dog. Dog? Cried Sarah. I thought he was a werewolf. Gaspar made a hissing noise, which I found very disturbing until I finally realized that it was laughter. Bob is a were-human, he explained. Most of the time, he's a cocker spaniel. But when the moon is full, he turns into something sort of like a human. It's very frightening for him. Bob whined in agreement. Gaspar tapped the end of his own long face and said, there must be a full moon tonight, or Bob would have returned to his normal form. At least, I think he would. It's hard to say how what we have been through would affect his condition. How did you get so small? Sarah asked. Gaspar's eyes grew wide. Treachery, he replied, raising a clenched fist into the air. Fool, treachery. It is the work of my brother, Martin. He was the one who shrank us. Did he turn you into monsters too? I asked. Oh no, hissed Melisande, the words coming from the snakes on her head rather than from her mouth. We did that ourselves. Only we don't like the word monsters. We prefer to say that we are special. You wanted to become special? Asked Sarah in astonishment. Ludmilla smiled, showing her fangs. Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Her accent reminded me of Bela Lugosi in Dracula. Since none of the others had that accent, and since she was supposed to be their sister, I wondered if she was faking it, or if it had came with the transformation that made her a vampire to begin with. Bob sat down and tried to scratch behind his left ear with his foot. He couldn't quite manage it, though. Melisande patted his head sympathetically, then scratched behind the ear for him. Do you know where our enemy is? Asked Gaspar, his forked tongue flicking through his thin lips. Now that we are free, there is a score to settle, and we must... Albert tugged at his lab coat. Listen, boss, there's something you need to know. What? Asked Gaspar impatiently. We've been sleeping for over 50 years. Gaspar threw back his head and hissed in rage, his clenched fist waving them at the ceiling, his thick tail thrashing back and forth. Pertify upon pertify, he cried. Now does the word say. Gaspar, you were a fool to trust your scheming brother. He staggered and gasped. Ethel! What about Ethel? Now, boss, said Albert, don't get yourself in a state. Who's Ethel? Asked Sarah. Gaspar dropped his hands to his side, chest heaving. He said, I don't wish to speak of it. He narrowed his eyes. Does Martin still live? I hesitated, not sure how he would take the news. Well, he demanded. Well, I said, if Martin was the guy we used to call Old Man Morley, he died last month. Gaspar hissed again. No chance to say goodbye, no time to heal old wounds. Oh world, why must you be so dark? Suddenly he stood up straight and declared, We have to get back to the house as soon as possible. Why? Asked Sarah. It is only way for us to return to our proper size, hissed the snakes on Melisandre's head, writhing in agitation. The only way? I asked nervously. Absolutely, said Gaspar. He sounded desperate. Everything we need is in my laboratory, not only the scientific equipment, but also the ingredients for my spells. You do science and magic? Asked Sarah. Why does that surprise you? Asked Ludmilla, showing her fangs. Sarah shrugged. I don't know, it just seems weird. Sarah's right, I said, which were words I almost never spoke. In the movies, they always use either science or magic to do stuff, but not both. Gaspar sighed as if it was an old argument. That represents a small-minded view of the world, he said. But then people always do like to put things in little boxes. I didn't mention that he had been in a little box when I found him. It's like thinking that an artist should either paint pictures or make statues, but not both, he continued. But what law says you can't combine things? After all, the ancient Greeks used to paint their statues. I looked at him in surprise. Are you positive about that? I've seen pictures of those statues. They sure don't look painted to me. It wore off, snapped Gaspar. His tongue flicked over his sharp little teeth, giving him a dangerous look. I decided not to argue. The point is, he said a little more calmly, you should not limit your possibilities. Actually, boss, put in Albert, the main point right now is that we have to get back to Morley Manor if we're going to get unshrunk. Gaspar put a hand on Albert's non-humpy shoulder. You are correct, as usual, old friend. I glanced uneasy at Sarah, then said, I'm afraid there's a small problem. Of course there's a problem, said Gaspar wearily. This is life. There is always a problem. Well, what is it this time? When Sarah blurted out the answer, they're going to start tearing down Morley Manor tomorrow morning. All 5 little monsters began to carry on something awful. Melisand's snakes had a hissy fit. Ludmilla turned into an inch-long bat and fluttered around like a moth at a candle. Gaspar put his arm to his brow like some tragic hero. Oh, grim and unrelenting world, he cried, tipping back his head. That's a man's home, should it be so easily wrenched from his grasp. Does evil never take a holiday? Does sorrow never cease its sordid work? Don't worry, boss. You'll think of something, said Albert. At the same time, Bob howled a tiny, piteous howl. Oh, stop, said Sarah at last. If it's that important, we'll take you back tonight. We will? I asked in surprise. We have to, Anthony, said Sarah, her voice urgent. They need our help. I realized she was right. Tonight was the last chance the monsters would have to get back to their regular size. On the other hand, I wasn't sure that having them get big again was such a good idea. Did we really want 5 full-sized monsters running around Owl's Roost? As if he had read my mind, Gaspar said, Not only is it the only way for us to turn to our regular size, it is the only way for us to return home. And what is the phrase? Get out of your hair? Melisand's snakes hissed in agreement. This confused me. I thought this was where you lived. I mean, here at Owl's Roost. Or do you mean back to your own time? Our other home, hissed Melisand's snakes, beyond the starry door. What's the starry door? Asked Sarah. Never mind that now, snapped Gaspar, giving Melisande a dark look. If we don't get back to Morley Manor before they tear it down, we'll be stuck at this size forever. And we will have to stay with you, added Ludmilla, who had been morphed back into her human shape. Then she licked her lips and grinned in a way that made me very uncomfortable. Ludmilla's grin settled. While it might be cool to have monsters around for a while, I didn't think I wanted it to be a permanent situation. Who knew how long Ludmilla can control herself? But as much as I wanted to help them, not to mention get them out of the house, I was still a little nervous about what might happen when they got back to full size. If we do help you get big, you won't eat us or drink our blood or anything like that, will you? I asked nervously. Gaspar was outraged. What kind of people do you think we are? He cried, his eyes blazing. I spread my hands. I don't have the slightest idea. Ludmilla put a hand on Gaspar's shoulder and whispered in his ear. I could see him relax a little. Turning to me, he said, My apologies for my outburst. Your concern is not unfounded. Let us see if we can reduce it a bit. Family, assemble. Quickly, all 5 little monsters got in line, placing his clenched fist over his heart. Gaspar said, In return for your assistance, we pledge to you. He paused, then looked at us curiously. What are your names, please? I'm Anthony Walker, and this is my sister Sarah. Gaspar nodded solemnly. In return for your assistance, we pledge to you, Anthony Walker, and Sarah Walker, our friendship, our support in time of need, our sacred honor, and our hope for the better tomorrow. Thus speaks the family Morleskevich. Thus speaks the family Morleskevich, he shouted the rest of them, except Bob, of course. Then all 5 monsters made a deep bow in our direction. I noticed that Gaspar managed to keep from bumping his nose this time. Morley asked Sarah. Our name before we came to America, said Gaspar. We only use it for our most serious oaths. Well, they could have been lying, but we decided to believe them. It wasn't as if we had much choice. We have to go get dressed, I said. We will wait for you here, said Gaspar. I opened the door to the hallway. To my horror, Mr. Perkins came bounding into the room. I tried to catch him, but missed. Hissing and snarling, the vicious monkey headed straight for our tiny friends. Alright, guys, that was chapter 3 and chapter 4. So, next time I will read chapters 5 and chapter 6. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Hopefully you're enjoying the suspense and the cliffhangers, and I will talk to you next time.